Yeah. Thank you very much, Andre Schneider and Mr. Witt. I would also like to welcome you very warmly and be very brief. The topic is very clear. It's a question of the CEO's salaries. We would like to discuss how they are fixed. What is the value of a good CEO? I don't think we can give a value judgment on the quality of CEOs here. The question of whether there's any need to have specific mechanisms that are used to fix the salaries of CEOs, or should we simply accept the fact that there are some CEOs and members of board of administrations that simply earn a lot? I'm very happy to introduce the participants here, who are nearly all Swiss or from Switzerland. I'll begin with our guest from the United States, Mrs. Hilda Ochoa-Brillembourg. She is President and CEO of Strategic Investment Group, United States.
Können Sie uns vielleicht...
Could you perhaps explain to us right at the beginning what your profession is, what your activity is, so that we know where to place you?
Thank you, Christine. I'm very happy to be here. This is a better place to be than in the other forum.
Why?
Because you're in direct contact with people who have emotions, opinions.
We have a technical problem here, I think.
And are being given a voice. Where I come from is I'm an entrepreneur. I started my own firm 20 years ago, 1987. I'm a portfolio manager. The firm now has a series of companies. Altogether, we are about 200 employees and manage about $45 billion for pension funds, endowments, foundations, both in the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East. I also serve on 2 public company boards. And I have opinions like every other human being.
Okay, we can't wait to hear them. But first I'm going to introduce the other guests. I start over there. This is Dirk Schütz, Chefredakteur von Cash. Hat ein Buch geschrieben mit dem Titel Gierige Chefs, warum kein Manager 20 Millionen wert ist. Daneben ihm sitzt Peter Ulrich. Er ist Gründer und Direktor des Instituts für Wirtschaftsethik an der HSG der Universität St. Gallen. Dann hier.
Here we have someone who's very well known in the discussion, Mr. Peter, not Thomas Minder, of course, Chief Executive Officer of Trybol. And you are now being termed a rebel in the small and medium-sized enterprises world. Next to Mrs. Ochoa-Brillembourg, we have Ulrich Grete. He is chairman of the board of directors, Swiss Social Security Fund. He manages responsible for the management of over 20 billion Swiss francs. He used to be Director General of the UBS. Then on his left, we have Mr. Björn Johansson, headhunter, entrepreneurial consultant, and he is chairman of Dr. Bjorn Johansson Associates. Welcome. I've got a question for you. Will you tell us how much your salary was last year? How much you earned? I can't remember. I do not recollect. No, it's true. I haven't done my tax return yet. It was a little more than the year before. Very happy to hear. Mr. Grete, how much did you earn last year? In 2006, for the same reason, I don't know what it was. In 2005, my salary, that's to say where I was really remunerated for the work that I did, my salary was about 250,000 Swiss francs. Do you find it difficult to say this here? No. Good. Mrs. Ochoa-Brillembourg, what did you earn last year?
Maybe you try mine.
No, that's okay.
It's okay?
I don't need to translate for myself.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay.
I'm not going to say, but it's a lot less than the majority of CEOs in the United States.
Mhm. Wie war es bei Ihnen, Herr Minder?
And you, Mr. Minder? I don't think we're talking about the salaries of an entrepreneur of a small or medium-sized enterprise, and it's totally irrelevant, in my opinion. an entrepreneur of such a small and medium-sized enterprise actually invests his own salary into the company. Okay, we'll come back to that later on. Mr. Ulrich? Well, an ordinary professor at a university in the upper salary category gets about 200,000 a year. Mr. Schütz? Well, it's certainly less than the 20 million that is the title of my book. Now, why am I asking this question? Actually, it's none of our business how much you earn. Compared with the salaries of CEOs who manage companies that are quoted on the stock markets, because more or less or directly or indirectly, it's your money because of the pension funds that they manage on your behalf. So, Mr. Ulrich, could you tell us why it really concerns us? Why should we know how the CEOs earn, like Mr. Brabeck or Mr. Vasella? Well, usually the reaction, this gut reaction to hearing how much the CEOs earn is simply the reason is simply envy, and on the other hand, the other side of the coin is one covets these salaries. And I don't think it's really a question of how much a manager earns personally. I think it is simply a symptom of a certain mentality of maximizing the doctrine of shareholder value, homo economicus, regulatory individualism, marketing everything. This is the kind of mentality that is becoming very widespread. So we have to be very careful about this. It's also a symptom of a dramatically changing power balance in our society. I don't want to be too detailed. It's very important to distinguish between several things. In the United States, for example, the ordinary employee or worker has no participation in the increase in productivity, hasn't had so in the last 15 years. It isn't reflected in their salaries, whereas it is in that of the CEOs and the upper management. So the middle classes are coming under a lot of pressure, and there's no coincidence. It's not by surprise that in most countries there is much discussion about how jobs are becoming more and more precarious. Can I interject here? This is a very valuable analysis, and I'm sure we'll come back to certain points later on. I just would like to underline once more why this really is our business, why we should know. Even though I said earlier on that it's none of our business to know how much you earn. Mr. Grete, I did say this earlier on, you are responsible for the management of 20 billion Swiss francs, that is to say money that comes from the people. Could you tell us where this is being invested? This is social security and pensions? Well, one could go on about this at length, and in any case, all the information is public. You can find it all on the internet if you're interested. The compensation fund for old age pensions is a special kind of investment type because you are not saving here for individual pensions. The horizon, the time frame is about 10 years, not 30 years, because one has to compensate for the deficit, the current deficit, and the pensions that have to be paid out. We invest our funds, about 30% is invested in Swiss francs, in bonds, and 30% in bonds in foreign currencies, another 30% in shares, that's to say equity, and about 7% indirectly in real estate. That's your real estate funds. So the major share of these funds are not invested in Swiss companies, but foreign companies, foreign enterprises, because the fund then has to make payments whenever the Swiss economy is not doing very well, because then usually the income is not enough to pay for the current pensions that have to be paid out. If we had an equilibrium, then there would be quite a big risk that when we have to sell off investments to pay for these pensions, the value of these investments would fall, would be very low. That is why these compensation funds are seen as the largest investor in Swiss shares, and that is completely wrong. For good operating reasons and in the interest of those that are insured, those who still pay in to the system and those who receive pensions are obviously interested in a good result of our investments, of a good return on our investments. They're not interested in what the CEOs earn. The moderator: yes, but of course that is part of it. When the expenditure of a company increases astronomically, because salaries are rising, the salaries that are paid to the CEOs or to the upper management are unreasonable, then obviously this is to the detriment of the employees. So one should not behave as if one was directly affected. Obviously, one will have to express one's views. There is some influence. Thank you very much, Mr. Grete. These salaries, 2-digit millions, we're talking about 30, 40 million. Do you feel that this is justified? I'm asking all of the panelists. You've already said it very clearly, Mr. Schütz. You said no one is worth that much. I think we have to see the historical background. At the end of the 90s, a CEO in Switzerland, at best, would perhaps get a salary of 5 million at a bank. The figures are much higher today, 20, 30, 40 million, and you cannot even calculate it anymore because the bundles are so very complicated, so that even those who get the salaries don't know how much they're getting. Take Novartis, so many different figures are mentioned in the media that it's gigantic. But if you look at the historical background, you could ask whether this increase is justified. You can do it, you can criticize it from all sorts of points of view, envy, covetousness, whatever. Doesn't help us in economic terms. But is the economic increase commensurate with the increase in salaries? And the answer is quite clearly no. If you look at this increase from 2 to 20 or 3 to 30 million, as would be the case in the banks, the value share has not increased by 10 or by 20. And that is how the shareholders would like to evaluate the value of a company. So this gigantic leap that has occurred only for the CEOs, not for the ordinary employees, is what is not reasonable. Do you think that these salaries are justified?
Let me first answer the question as to why do we care and should we care. And my answer to that is yes, we should care what a public company executive makes, because they've asked us for our money. They haven't risked theirs. They're not entrepreneurs. So that's the first reason to care. What you do once you care about it is also very important. I do not believe that regulating salaries of public companies is the solution for that. I do happen to believe that the famous word, transparency, information, full information is very important. One, because it eventually brings shame to the people who are getting these huge salaries. And if it doesn't bring sufficient shame to them so that they have a way to retract their own negotiations, their own what they're asking for their own human capital, then it creates groups of pressure that do accomplish something. We don't want to get to the point where we discourage good people from going into public company service. We do not want to do that. But on the other hand, we do want to know what they make. We do want to know whether there is sufficient competition for the job. And we do want to make sure that there is pay for performance and that they're not defrauding the public by changing the performance benchmarks and that the performance benchmarks are fair. That would go a long way to making the public feel that their compensation is fair, even if it's very large. Mm-hmm. We don't seem to care that Warren Buffett has made hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, or that Bill Gates makes trillions of dollars, whether it's salary or whether it's return on his human capital. We don't seem to care about that. But we do care that someone who has used somebody else's money with no major entrepreneurial risk does get those very high forms of compensation. Maybe it's well deserved. Maybe they have added value, but maybe not.
That's the thing I would like to find out. Maybe they deserve. Mm-hmm. Do they deserve? Verdienen die das wirklich, Björn Johansson?
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, erstens hier in der Schweiz, die Personen, um denen es sich hier dreht, können wir auf 2 Hände zählen. Es sind vielleicht 10 Leute. Und zwar in 2 Firmengruppen. Das ist bei der Credit Suisse und UBS und bei Roche und Novartis. Eventuell das Salär von Herrn Brabeck bei Nestle. Aber die meisten Firmen, Konzerne in der Schweiz, die Sulzers, die Rieters,
the Fischer, the Schwarz, the cantonal banks, but also Swisscom, Start and so on, they earn quite normal salaries in international comparison by international standards. They earn well, of course, but not the kinds of astronomical salaries we're talking about here. And the question that you've asked, do they deserve these salaries? We've seen an explosive increase in the last 5 years, but the results of those 5 years, of these 4 companies, have also been very good. Novartis, for example, in the past 10 years, they have enormously increased their turnover each year, and there is performance. And the same thing is true with UBS and Roche. UBS is probably one of the best banks there is, and we can be proud of that in Switzerland. In Credit Suisse, we've had an enormous turnaround in the last 3 or 4 years. Does that mean yes, then? Asks the moderator. Well, it means I hope we've reached a plateau where salaries won't continue moving upwards. I think it'll be very difficult to bring them down, but I hope that they won't undergo any further substantial increase in the next 5 years. But I'd still like to know, you're an advisor, a consultant, and you know the whole machinery, which is something we'd like to talk about as well. But your personal view, can you actually say, your personal view is, yes, it's okay, they deserve it. 40 million, 25 million, 40 million, it's okay, it has been earned. Yes, it's okay, says Mr. Johansson. There are people who earn a lot more than this 40 million here in Switzerland. Well, there are people who earn a great deal less as well. Okay, I understand. You're saying it is all right. I'd like to know your view, Mr. Minder. I don't think it is okay at all. And even if we're talking about two-figure millions, even 1 million, and if it were only just a handful of people, I think it's absolutely sick. We've already got this happening in small companies, and the discrepancy is getting ever wider. When you're talking about 20 or differential of 20 or 30 times from the lowest to the highest pay in the same company, in the same enterprise. And we will certainly be talking about the machinery. I think this is absolutely sick. It's pathological. And for me personally, this is a modern form of enrichment. It is actually theft. And managers, too, are employees of the firm. They're not entrepreneurs. They are employees. It used to be that you had the employer and the employee, and they were all in the same boat. And if the firm went under, everybody would lose their money, including the top people. But the fates are no longer the same. The manager, his biggest risk is that he gets kicked out, but he's given a golden parachute. And Mr. Johansson it's got nothing whatever to do with performance, because if it were, then if you look what happened to somebody who came to Novartis 7 or 8 years ago and earned $1 million, he has increased his salary 30 or 40-fold in those 7 or 8 years. How can that be? How can this machinery be allowed to operate? It's completely sick. Well, anybody want to say anything about that? Well, I share the view that the salaries have certainly changed. They have been Americanized. I'll concede that. But the difference from 1 to 400 or 500, we've seen that happen in America, and it's true in a very few, 4 or 5 firms here in Switzerland. We're seeing something similar going on. That is a fact. And one reason for that is certainly the Americanization, the introduction of multinational management teams. And there is a market for these top management people. And there are very few people who could do this. And I could count them on the fingers of 2 hands, as I say. This is something which we need to discuss. Of course, it's not just in Switzerland. We live in a global world, not just in Switzerland, and we can't say things work differently here. Well, I'd like to say something about the market argument. We've heard a lot about that. No economist takes this seriously any longer. It's never happened that one of the highly paid American CEOs have lost their jobs and then taken a job in Europe. When a big American firm sees they're very well paid, that's true, but they're never going to hire people from Europe, and you can statistically demonstrate that the market argument simply doesn't apply at the highest level. And there's been an interesting discussion in the last few years, and we've had greater transparency in Switzerland, and the market, it's said that the market must regulate this, but we know that this argument doesn't work. If you look at Morgan Stanley and Pfizer and the big pharma companies, you see people leaving in droves, but there isn't a market operating there. A market functions when there is a sufficient supply and demand. And it's always said that it's narrow at the top. And if there is one example where the market isn't working, it's precisely in America with all the excesses that we've seen 2 weeks ago. We had 200 million compensation for a Pfizer chief who left. America cannot be taken as an example. And the market isn't just American, though. Well, 10 years ago, in 1997, there were only 2 international managers here in Switzerland. and Nestle, big companies, and now it's well over 30 companies in Switzerland are run by foreigners, by Americans, Swedes, Danes, Dutchmen, English people, lots of people from Germany. The biggest private bank in Zurich is run by Dutchman or a German. Two of the best private banks, if we'd said that 5 years ago, that two of our biggest private banks are going to be run by foreigners, lots of examples could be given of these big companies being run by foreigners. And in America as well, in recent weeks, we've seen top people leaving multinational companies. In one case, it was the vice chairman of General Electric. He left, got 49. It was a 49 billion business, and a turnover of $4.5 billion. So there is a trend here in the multinational companies and people leaving for private equity firms. So there is a market operating there. And the explosion in the last 10 years, everybody's talking at once.
Ja, ich bleibe beim Markt, da halte ich mich lieber an.
Yes. He put aside the market consideration and said his personal view. And the personal view was, and you as consultants, you look at a reference, you look at your own salaries and your own CEOs, and you take that as your benchmark. And then if you apply that to America, Novartis says sympathetically, but not at the top, but at least in average. So what has actually happened practically in the last 10 years? The remuneration system has responded to a number of factors. I'm sorry to interrupt you, says the moderator, but you keep saying the market, but there isn't a market. That's a metaphysical consideration. Well, let me ask Mr. Johansson, what would Mr. Vasella do in that case? We'll pick up all the points that you've made, but I'd just like to hear quickly, what about Mr. Brabeck, Mr. Vasella, all of these other people? We know what are they supposed to do when they leave their positions? Where do they go in America? Where do they go next? They go into private equity companies. We're quite clear about that. To Blackstone or Texas Pacific Group, they're picked up the very next day, and they're going to earn a whole lot more than they did in, for example, than they would in Roche or the like. So, if you ask what a person is earning in market terms, then these people, they will change their occupation in order to earn. Mr. Johansson, rightly, I think, said, and it's important that we should get away from this narrow nationalist thinking in Switzerland. They've said that in reference to talent, the management situation have become internationalized, and the Swiss economy, Swiss business, the very large but also the medium-sized businesses can only engage in international terms competitively in order to get the talent they need when they are selecting their top people. They have to position themselves internationally. So it's not primarily a question of remuneration. It's primarily a question of the quality of the quality of the work. And if we talk about market in that connection, it's important that we don't fall into the trap of setting salary levels in equal market terms, because it is talent. It has to do with talent, it has to do with the level of responsibility, and the offer has then to be international. And that has happened in Swiss firms to an extent that nobody expected 10 years ago. This is a positive development, but it doesn't mean that these top salaries are necessarily right. But we have to see it in qualitative terms. It's far more important. Quality is far more important for the success of the enterprise. Be interesting to hear. There have been repeated references to the United States and to the salary levels there and how they have exploded in recent years across the big pond. Looking at the market situation with Europe and Switzerland, how do you think? What do you think of the situation?
Yes, they have exploded over the past 5 years. One of the reasons why I became an entrepreneur is because I felt I could become wealthier being an entrepreneur than fighting it out in a corporate environment. And I was right for about 15 years. In the last 5 years, CEO salaries and top management level salaries, but mostly CEOs, have exploded. There has been executive compensation inflation, the same way that there has been inflation in all kinds of other assets. Human capital at certain levels has been enjoying inflationary numbers. The best business, I love this saying, that the best business anyone could engage in is buying somebody for what you think they're worth and selling them, buying them for what you think they're worth and selling them for what they think they're worth. Unfortunately, that is seldom. There is no market for that, although we can have opinions about that, and the opinions can be very passionate, particularly if the information becomes public. If everyone in this room knew what everyone else was making, everyone would get mad. Those that are making less than the others would get furious. And those who were making more than the others would still get mad that they're not making as much as some other people who they think are dumber than they are. So the markets for human capital, as you well said, are not perfect, are very far from perfect. They are slightly more perfect, though, than the market for spouses. Talking about oligopolies, okay? There is never free information and there is no open supply and demand. I don't mean to make light of this because you have made very important points. For markets to function, you need information and you need access to the markets. And that for executive pays is not as fully developed as it should be. The question is, what do we do about that? Because you certainly don't want to cap them and say no executive in any company is going to make more than X. Because then what it means is that many public companies will go private. There is sufficient liquidity around the world right now to bring to private markets a large portion of the public companies, particularly those that are paying very high salaries. And a lot of that is going to begin to happen and has begun to happen in the United States. So the solution is not to put a cap and say you can't do this, you cannot get more than X. The solution is transparency. In Europe, no one knew what anyone made. In America, at least we've been knowing what people have been making for the last 15 years. Everyone knows what it is. Not completely, by the way, but as of the year 2008, you will know all of the hidden payments will come out in the open. So.
We're working on that too here in Europe and in Switzerland to have more information und Transparenz. Sie wollten noch was sagen?
You also want to say something, Mr. Schütz, about the market, because I'd like to come back to it. Yes, it can be done very simply. If you were to offer 10 million less to these highly paid CEOs, just tell them they'll get 10 million less. Do you think they would then simply be able to say, well, I'm being offered much more by an American company and I don't care? This has never happened. CEOs at that level don't just get taken away by other companies. Mr. Ulrich, I think that the whole matter is becoming very embarrassing for the CEOs themselves when they get these fantastic golden handshakes. Why should companies pay these enormous amounts? I think one can only compare this with what happens in agriculture. You compare between what is useful and between vermin, and you simply pay for getting rid of vermin. And what about performance? Let me take this a step further. You wrote about this, Mr. Minder. You're talking about fleecing. I will come back to what you have written in your text, but it's also this mentality of self-service, of simply dipping into the kitty. Does this mean that the CEOs themselves should simply say how much they want to earn? What's really sick is the functioning of these remunerations committees. Yes, according to the stock exchange law, companies have to have these committees, and the members of these committees are buddies, and they are the ones who decide how much the CEOs get. So the more he grants the CEO, or the more these members of the remunerations committees grant the CEOs, the more they will probably be paid. So the whole thing is sick. It's obscene. Migros and Co-op don't have these remunerations committee, and I really don't know how to term this. I don't see why this should be fixed year by year. These salaries are fixed for the top CEOs, not for middle management. And these remunerations committees meet 4 or 5 times a year, and they talk about their own salary that they're going to get. I don't even like the whole attitude. Mr. Schütz has described this very well in his book on how these remunerations committees operate. We want independent people to determine what the CEOs should earn, and that it is the shareholders who should appoint these members of the remunerations committee. It should not be done internally. This whole system might then work a little better. Okay, can we perhaps come back to how the whole thing operates? KMPG and the University of St. Gall have performed a study on how the CEOs are remunerated in Switzerland. I don't know whether we have the same kind of studies that have been conducted for the United States. So you, Mr. Johansson, you should really know how this works, since you also headhunt such highly paid CEOs or executives. These regulations state that it is usual that in a company it is the chairman of the board who decides how much the CEO is supposed to earn, and the CEO then decides how much the managers are supposed to earn. Is that how it happens in reality? Could you explain this to us a little bit? Yes, let me just make some comments about what has happened in the past, where it is true there were some cases of old boys networks, whether it's in the economy or in politics, where this was handled in such a way. Now, there's much more of a demand for transparency nowadays, and this has led to an increase in the salaries. I've been in this market for 27 years, and I don't work as an editor of a newspaper or at a university. I'm really in this market, and there is a market for CEOs, and there is a market in which there is transparency. In any case, it's not just a problem that concerns Switzerland. In Norway, it's just as much of a problem. Norway is my home country. In America, in Germany, in Great Britain, it's the same problem, this problem of the remunerations committees. There's a lot of change going on in boards of directors of companies. So there's a move towards breaking up these old boys networks, and I call this the professionalization of the boards of directors. They are becoming smaller. The members are of a more international quality, and it's not you scratch my back, I scratch yours. And I would say that there is a kind of a revolution going on in the big corporations and the medium-sized ones. I can tell you that this is a debate. It is a subject that is really being discussed very, very hard, this question of remuneration. Completely different situation from what we had 2 or 3 years ago. Those who are members of remunerations committees spend a lot of time on studying this matter and determining the salaries of the CEOs and their own honorarium, their own remuneration. The market is reacting to what people like Mr. Minder and Mr. Schütz have stated and said. And I can tell you that in 3 to 4 or 5 years' time, we will have quite different compositions and different salaries on boards of directors. The salaries will be evening out. New things will come on stream, which we don't know yet, but a lot is going to happen. Is that reality or is that just wishful thinking? Asks the moderator. Just one comment about transparency. It is very disputed whether transparency increases or does not increase the salaries. 2 Harvard professors have written a book on pay without performance. They have studied this very clearly. Their conclusion is that transparency does not increase the salaries. The largest increase in salaries in Switzerland from 2 to 20 million at the banks and at Nestlé occurred at a time when there was no transparency in Switzerland in about 2001. Then when we had transparency, we saw how high the salaries had risen. Obviously, this has caused also more greed. To come back to the Remunerations Committee, this comes back to market mechanism. Mr. Minder mentioned this as well. This interplay between supply and demand simply does not work. That the person who blesses the level of CEO salaries does this because there's an incentive, because this whole mechanism neutralizes the market mechanism. Most of us who work in a company get their salaries, and it is the boss who tells us, well, you cannot have an increase in salary because it's not good for the company. But the ones right at the top are, of course, interested in this incentive of getting more. And as long as there is this incentive, the mechanism does not work. At the top, that is why I'm saying at the top, this market mechanism doesn't work. That is why the remunerations committees should be disbanded and their work should be done by the shareholders. And that is what has been done in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Australia, and we will probably do it as well. Okay, this brings me back to Mr. Grete. You have explained to us how the money is distributed. Why do shareholders not defend itself a little more? Why don't they complain more about these mechanisms? Because the company does not belong to the CEO. Well, I'll try and answer this question, but I want to say something before I answer it. And having listened to Mr. Minder now, then this was pure demagoguery. He gives the impression as if he knew what happens in these remunerations committees and knows how they operate. Mr. Minder knows exactly that this is not the case, and Mr. Schütz does not sit on these remunerations committees. So these are the sirens calling, and we have to be very careful. Do not listen to them. I'm not saying that the remuneration of Mr. Varela is just or fair. I feel that it's impossible to earn that much money. You can simply accept it if you're given it. And this is something I've said in the past. But beware, don't be misled. The moderator. I'll come back to you then, Mr. Grete. You're a shareholder. I cannot just leave this without reacting to what you have just said when you mentioned that what has just been said by Mr. Minder and Schütz is the sirens calling. Even the president of Economist has said that the members of the Remunerations Committee should be independent. So this is not my own production. Mr. Schütze has written a very good book about this, and I'm sure he can explain to us how these Remunerations Committees function. And you can see it in the annual reports, who the members are and how much the members of the Remunerations Committee get. Mr. Silo, who is 76 years old, who's had a postponement of the age limit. It's a scandal that he should be a member of a remunerations committee. I can only see an independent remunerations committee bringing about a change in this kind of mechanism. Can we perhaps have a response to what was said about the sirens call? It's not a Swiss phenomenon, says Mr. Schütze. The whole thing has affected us because it came from the United States. And the Swiss companies have really taken on the American business model wholesale. And Warren Buffett himself analyzed this very carefully. In his annual report, in his business report, he states that the major problem that the United States is the wage policy, the salaries policy. And he said that the problem is that the Remunerations Committee behave as if they were distributing monopoly money that has been won in a gambling hall. And it doesn't really belong them, and that's why it doesn't matter how much they distribute. That's why I'm saying that the mechanism is not working. It's not a Swiss phenomenon. It exists elsewhere. The people at the top have no incentive whatsoever to pay out little. And an owner of a company cannot do this because he needs the money to survive, to let the company survive. And I'm repeating myself, it should be delegated to the shareholders' assembly. Well, in the case of Swiss companies, it would be nonsense to do so. It simply would not work. At the UBS, I had the responsibility for human resources for many years, and there simply wasn't a remunerations committee at the time. All these ideas have reached us from the United States, and fortunately we had not taken on these ideas yet at the time. Then, at the time, there was simply some negotiation. The employers thought about the salary systems, and for every level, salaries were fixed for every category. And at the time when there was no system, really, there was no abuse, no excesses. Let me now say something about shareholders and shareholder meetings. We're talking about Swiss companies and not American companies. This difference is a very important one. In Switzerland, the shareholders have never determined the salaries, the remuneration of the top executives. In Switzerland, there is a very clear distribution of responsibility, and it is as follows. The board of directors is responsible for the upper management, the upmost management level of the company. And amongst others, the selection of the operating officers is the responsibility of the board of directors. Usually there are several officers who have to be appointed. And another responsibility is to evaluate how well they have worked, what contribution have they made to the result of the company, to the operations, and how this is to be remunerated fairly. This is a responsibility that cannot be taken away from the board of directors, nor can the board delegate this. So this idea of delegating it to the shareholders in the case of a Swiss company is nonsense, because you cannot just ask the board of directors to determine the business model, the strategy, and then the subordinate question of remuneration of the chief operating officers to be delegated to another body. There are two different things, however, when it is a question of defining the remuneration of the board of directors. That is something that has to be done by the shareholders, since it is the shareholders who elect the board of directors. The shareholders have to decide whether they're electing the appropriate people. It is the shareholders who can perhaps decide or not whether the whole procedure is the appropriate one. And that is why the shareholder meeting should also determine the level of fair remuneration of the members of the board of directors. This is something that could be done quite easily, and it would also be fully in harmony with the structure of accountability and responsibilities that we have in Switzerland. This could be put in the Articles of Association of any company, and then it would be the shareholder meeting that would decide and determine the remuneration that is paid to the members of the board. But one has to also discuss this question of the dual mandate, that is to say, to be chairman of the board and CEO at the same time in the big companies. That also could be regulated. This would concern Mr. Brabeck, for example, Mr. Basella. Now, to forbid it, we don't know whether that would be very fruitful or productive. Now, let's assume that a shareholder meeting, which has its composition that fluctuates, has to decide on the remuneration of a person unknown to the shareholders. They therefore cannot evaluate the value of this person, but nonetheless the shareholders would have to determine their remuneration. So there would have been a request to pay 100,000. The previous year the remuneration was 80,000. And the shareholder meeting then says, yes, we accept 100,000 because the result achieved was a good one. Following year, there is an application to reduce that board member's salary to 70,000 because the results of the company were not that wonderful. Then the shareholders say no. So the board member concerned would continue to receive a salary of 100,000 even though the results achieved were not good. This is not something that can be decided by popular vote, and the statement that indicates that it works perfectly well in the Netherlands and in the UK is absurd. In the Netherlands, the flow of information between the board of directors and the main shareholders works, and that is where the main influence is taken. So this brings us back to the previous question. What should the shareholders do? Well, they should have some influence. Well, how can this be done? By voting against something that does not suit the shareholders. For example, you could refuse to approve the annual accounts because too much has been paid out, or one does not re-elect those who have been involved in the poor results of a company. The Novartis shareholder assembly re-elected the person who was just denounced earlier on, Mr. Seeger. And what about the right of deposit? Well, that's another subject altogether which is misunderstood. The shareholders have the possibility of changing this. The Articles of Association allows this. But amongst the Swiss institutional investors who do not have the majority in the voting rights in the case of Swiss companies, this too is a misapprehension. That is why I said earlier on that the organization that I represented is not a major investor. Here too we need professionalization so that the institutional investors are seen as a fair negotiating partner at the level of the board of directors. So this brings us to the underlying problem, and that is that the professional management of many Swiss pension funds is absolutely too low. That is why the Swiss pension funds cannot play the role that they should. In the UK, this is much better.
Well, this is very important and interesting points made, but time is running. I wonder what you have to say about this. Well, I'd like to agree with Mr. Grete that the shareholders' assembly shouldn't be discussing individual salaries, but that doesn't mean that the shareholders' assembly can't discuss the remuneration system as such and the guidelines for determining salaries. But the two big banks, let's be concrete about this, distributed 20 million in bonuses. This is more than what went to the shareholders, what was left over for the shareholders. Over 50% of the profit, the net profit. So can you really call that a subordinate question for the shareholders? I really can't understand that. Can't go along with that. But that's the shareholders get paid after the bonuses are paid. So your comparison doesn't really work. You're comparing it with a cost factor, but I didn't say that these bonuses. I don't actually know if the sum you mentioned was correct, but whether that is sensible. I didn't say necessarily that it was reasonable. In the financial services, which is an area I know well, you have a situation where looking at the overall salaries paid to individuals, so it's at a lower level, 100,000, let's say, but for example, and sometimes you have a situation where certain people are very strongly. Their pay may depend very much on their changing circumstances. They can get very much in the way of bonuses one year, and then the next year it may fluctuate. This is not the level of the CEO. That's a different level. But the comparison with what happens with the shareholders, that you can't simply state it in those terms. That isn't professional. But Mr. Grete, you know the law governing shares and shareholders, and it says perfectly clearly that the regular reserves have to be built up first, then the shareholders get their 5% of dividend, and then what's left, the General Assembly of shareholders can then make decisions about the distribution of the remaining profit. And the remuneration and the bonuses are so scandalously high that they can't be regarded in those terms. The board of directors doesn't have a bonus, and the General Assembly is empowered, if there has been a good business result, to agree to that. And 85% of the remuneration can be variable. It's only after decisions have been taken about the distribution of the profit in the board of directors that the bonus levels are set in order to comply with the law. But it's gone off the rails. Mr. Grete says this is you're arguing on a completely false basis. It is true that if the net profit is distributed, yes, first of all, the reserves have to be serviced, have to be built up. Then a dividend has to be paid. Only after that can the board of directors, and only the board of directors, grant a share of the profits, and that is part of their powers. That's true. But in practice, there is no company there's no company in Switzerland which acts in this way. And whether that's good or bad, that's another matter. But any General Assembly can decide whether to go back to a percentage system. The bonus is part of the costs, and it is the success-dependent component of the remuneration which creates the problem. This success-dependent component shouldn't melt like snow in summer. That's the problem. if Mr. Vazela in year X achieves result Y, and in year X plus 1 the success is considerably lower, then his success-dependent remuneration component must, at least to the same extent, be lower as well. But it was just these few extreme cases in Switzerland in recent years, and that's basically false. Well, I would like to very specifically to come back to the possible solutions to this. Well, as to that, possible solutions, I just wanted to say that we know more or less what the best practice is. You know what happens in England. Tony Blair has introduced legislation to ensure better practice, and the OECD as well. And it's been suggested that this is a lesser order problem. I don't agree. I think it's a very important one. And let's not forget we've got elections in Switzerland this year. The whole economy is suffering a severe blow to its reputation because of these excesses. This is an enormous problem because in the next elections, I think that the economy or business is going to be penalized. They are bringing discredit upon themselves. And it is a major social problem. It's a good thing it's now being discussed, but I don't think we should play it down. There are a lot of FDP people, even the SVP. It is not a problem which is confined to any one party. Well, looking at possible solutions, I'd like to come to you. It's been suggested that all of this has come to us from the United States, and now we have to deal with this and somehow resolve the situation. But we all seem to be agreed that it can't go on like this. The salaries can't go on rising in this way. But has this same discussion also blown up in the United States? And what in practice is being done in the US about all of this?
Yes, in office enough in Switzerland and in the United States, the public has become it's surprised. It's called sticker shock because of the explosion in profitability over the last 5 years. And I'm talking here about the good majority of the company which are experiencing record profits. Executive compensation has also exploded, and probably in some cases have exploded more than proportionately, particularly in cases in which it is felt by the employees, by the lower level employees, that they're losing their jobs, the profitability of the company is going up, and the chief executive is the one who's capturing all of these benefits, with a good number of the people getting put out of jobs. That is a problem. The shareholders are taking actions in the United States in the cases in which it's become very visible. And some of them, I'm not going to mention name, but some of them have been in the press recently, Home Depot being one of them. The shareholders are now voting to remove a large portion of the board members because of what happened there. That's not going to cure the problem. Still, you have a chief executive that apparently collected $200 million when the price of the stock had actually dropped by 17% in the last 5 years. So situations like this will always happen. They're unfair. They're immoral. They are unethical. They do not reflect well on capitalism or the free market system and create a political a backlash that is not necessarily good over the long run for free markets, but they do serve to correct some of the excesses, and that is happening in the United States. Question is, how far do you go? Do you put ceilings? I don't think so. Do you get into the discussion of what are appropriate benchmarks at a general level? Yeah, I do think that an open discussion of what are appropriate benchmarks with contributions from academics from all sides is a very useful debate. But you do not want to throw the baby with the bathwater. You do not want to make publicly traded firms unmanageable or undesirable to good people.
But who should have the key for the regulation? Is it the state? Is it by law? Or do you count on the market system?
I happen to prefer the market system with a lot of discussion happening in the public domain, with academics informing the system, with some people actually litigating the system, with I think, like as with democracy, a public debate concentrating on the various ways of looking at the issues is very important. I do not believe in an authoritarian solution, because they will fix the problem or seem to fix the problem temporarily, but will create much larger problems over the long run.
Because right next to me is sitting a man who tries to do it by the law, who tries to change the system by law. And ich möchte Sie bitten, Herr Minde, sagen Sie ganz konkret, was Ihre Initiative.
So, you yourself are on the street, and you can see what happens. So, if you want, do you want a change in the constitution? Do you want to correct these abuses through legislation? What is your actual practical suggestion? Well, the answer: the owners of the firm, and it is the shareholders who own the firm, it is they who should decide about the remuneration of their top management, and that is the principal demand of the initiative. That is annually in the shareholders' meeting, and should be a decision about the amounts. The total amount of the remuneration for the board of directors, for the top management, not for individuals, and the colleagues in those various bodies then distribute the sum accordingly. If you want an example from the Credit Suisse or the UBS, there the sum of the it's about 225 million a year for both of these. And if the shareholders find that this is in order, then they should approve that. And so the initiative doesn't actually set a ceiling. All we're saying is that it must be the shareholders who have the last word, because they own the company. So there are three considerations. It's always the constitution in Switzerland. There are never any legislative initiatives. There are three things that must be forbidden. First of all, bonuses to management, separation, redundancy payments, and other things of that kind. These three things should be forbidden. And the text is fairly complex, and that's because we've endeavored to close all the loopholes. Because if we didn't do that, if we didn't close all the back doors, as it were, and people will get very large pensions, for example, when they leave the company, or they simply become advisors, so they go and work for a subsidiary of the company as an advisor or a consultant, and they get their money that way. So that means that our text is rather complex for a people's initiative in order to close all these possible back doors. Well, these requirements, says the moderator, we can see what you're driving at, but what does Mr. Schutz mean about this? Think about this. No. We always hear that the state shouldn't intervene, but the state, in fact, intervenes in all sorts of areas. We have cartel law and so forth. Naturally, if the market were operating properly, the state wouldn't need to intervene. But when it comes to establishing top salaries, the markets have simply failed. And we need to get the market working properly again. That is to say that the owners have the right to decide about these salaries. And that's the route that Tony Blair took. And he's not a communist, is he, or what? Well, what do you think about this initiative, very specifically, Mr. Ulrich? Well, just let me say something first of all. I think this is the wrong question, market or state. I think it's bad if we start thinking in those terms. The market economy is part of our legal system. Of course, there's no question of intervention here. What we're talking about here is closing a gap in the legal order. And to that extent, I agree entirely with Mr. Minder that it's the most normal thing in the world. Secondly, very specifically, I'm in favor of the competence of the General Assembly to decide, this should be a binding decision, on the guidelines for remuneration. Not on actual amounts, but on the guidelines for determining the amounts. And that would include, and I think this is very important, a very liberal conception, that the Shareholders' Assembly itself can decide whether it wishes to set a maximum remuneration range, or rather they want to set the maximum range between the lowest and the highest pay. And there should be one condition as to whether the top managers increase their salary. Yes, there must be one condition that they bring up the lowest paid commensurately. Ochoa-Brillembourg, you've heard the proposals from Mr. Minder. What do you think about what has been suggested?
Obviously, the voters can decide how they want their economy and their political system run. What you have to make sure, as I said earlier, is that you do not end up destroying your enterprise system because you're putting in effect the wrong price controls. So I believe that voters, shareholders or voters alike, have the right to get involved in compensation formulas, in an understanding of the benchmarks that are being used to judge compensation. They can do that directly, or although preferably through a board of directors that does function well and that can be removed from office if they're not satisfying the needs of the shareholders. But remember that in the end, what shareholders will end up fighting for is the existence of publicly traded firms versus private firms. If we end up destroying the incentives to run publicly traded companies, there will be a disintermediation in the markets, and we will not be able to invest as broadly as we can now invest in public firms. So be careful what you wish for.
Man darf da sagen, das gilt ja auch nur.
Well, that would only be true for companies that are quoted on the stock exchange. But is all this absurd? All of these, what's being suggested by this initiative, is all that absurd? I don't think it's a good thing that these things should be enshrined in the Constitution. The Constitution is relatively immovable. It's hard to change it. It has already been said that these are quite complex relationships. And what might prevail, for example, in any individual company, like the range between the lowest and the highest pay, this isn't something that you can actually enshrine in a constitution. I've already said that I think it's right that the Assembly of Shareholders should make decisions about the board of directors, but not about individual amounts. That, I think, would be feasible. But if you move lower, if you move down to the management level, then you soon get into difficulties if you have a legislative solution, because the Swiss business world is very, very various. An internationally active corporation faces considerably different issues than a company which is operating only in Switzerland. And and faces entirely different problems from, or many very different problems from, a company which is quoted only on the Swiss exchanges. But the shareholders need to be able to control this as to whether lots of new legislation is necessary. My own view is that no, that isn't the case. The shareholders in Switzerland need to learn that even with they need to learn how to exercise the rights that they already possess. And so it happens very poorly. They need to work with the instruments that they already have and establish. And they need to learn how to work with those before they start introducing new ones. I think that would be a more sensible approach. We don't want to create obstacles for business which aren't necessary and which would be difficult to get rid of afterwards. The misgivings among our people, among our population, is quite considerable now about these developments. And to do something in legislative terms, that is up to the Federal Council and the Parliament. If that initiative goes through, it must mean that things aren't the way they should be. Well, we are approaching the end of this discussion. We've had the whole discussion. Without moralizing, but certain sign language has been going on, certain gestures have been made. You from the Evangelical Church have taken part in this discussion. And also, in the run-up to the Soben Forum, the churches are getting involved in this discussion. The churches are picking up getting the message from the people, and they can quite clearly see that social peace is imperiled. They see this gap, this discrepancy between salaries is no longer tolerable, and some very clear positions have been stated. The feeling of fairness, of justice needs to be restored. And that's just a question I'd like to put to you. I'd like to ask you in particular, because you've spoken so eloquently on this. These differences, 1 to 40, this range, this differential on the average, as you suggest that it could even be 1 to 500. Do you think that social peace and this feeling of fairness is under severe stress because of this? And there would be, Mr. Mender would have a good deal less wind in his sails for his initiative if that were not the case. Yes, I think that those who defend the status quo are the worst enemies of capitalism. The legitimacy which we stand upon is thin ice. People are not fools. They are being bought and sold, and they know that they don't want to hear any more talk about performance. But a small piece of advice to Mr. Johansson and the managers themselves: don't just talk about efficiency and performance, because, as differently from economists, ordinary citizens can make a clear distinction between efficiency and justice. These are two entirely different categories. One sentence on that, and then we'll go over to the audience. Well, one sentence. To start with, there was a very small group of people. This is not an enormous problem here in Switzerland, like in America. It is a very, very small group. And I believe that this idea that this could have a very negative impact in Switzerland if things continue in this direction. And last but not least, I think we've got much bigger problems, as we've seen in WEF in the recent days. We've got major environmental problems, big problems with education, innovation, with Africa, with AIDS. If we go on discussing in this direction, and if the companies could do more in this direction, then the world, and as well as the people here in Switzerland, I think would be better helped. And the last point I would say is if managers would take a part of their, devote a part of their, would give back part of their salaries for social purposes, and if top managers shouldn't move towards a strive for optimization of the tax regime. I think optimization of the tax system would also be good for the people. So I think the managers have something to contribute there as well. Oh, perhaps we could have you could consult a bit more intensively on that subject.
Ins Publikum.
Well, over to the public. Would you please stand up, introduce yourself very briefly? I'm from Berlin. What I'm missing in the discussion is exactly what you said. We are discussing this in a closed system. These salaries should be put in relationship to what it would mean to the poor. In hundreds of thousands of poor who are thronging to the social forum in Nairobi. I could also quote Brecht. We are simply using too much of the raw materials. We in the capitalist countries are the ones who decide about salaries. So I would like to hear something about not so much the ethical justification, but the other justification of how it can be that people here at 1,500 meters reserve the right to discuss these things for themselves without taking into account anyone else. Whom would you like to address this to? Mr. Johansson? Yes, I agree entirely with you. And if you see what Bill Gates is doing, a lot of his wealth is being invested in AIDS research, so there are many rich people who are doing charitable work. And in Switzerland, I feel that the Swiss CEOs could do a bit more of that as well, officially. But this mentality of donating is also a bit like feudalism. We have to beg on our knees to get money for things that will not give a return on the investment. So we have to decide whether we want democracy or neo-feudalism. Of course, donating is good, but it's coming much too late. We have to try and attack the roots. It's not end of pipe that we have to try and do something. Let me just give you one figure that I have jotted down. Only 100 million people worldwide own more than $20,000 a year. But more than 4 billion people earn less than $2,000 a year. Now that's a problem of global distribution. It is systemic. If we want to maintain the market economy and capitalism, if we want it to be sustainable, then we have to become a little more civilized, and I mean civilized. It is the freedom of the civil society that must take priority over the freedom of the market society. But unfortunately, the overall political trend is going against the development of the civil society rather than promoting it. And this is also a worldwide global problem that has to be reflected on. Yes, at the back here. Maybe you don't have a microphone yet. Microphone. Introduce yourself briefly.
Mein Name ist Stefan ich bin Mitarbeiter.
I work in Bern, and I'm very grateful for having unmasked this wrong debate about the market. Mr. Grete also spoke about this myth of performance, and very much is hidden by performance, that is to say, the power of those who manage companies, and this power is abused, it's misused, so that they get more remuneration. The real scandal is that they're not using this power to prevent environmental pollution, for example. They don't use their power to observe and respect social standards. Nestle doesn't do anything to prevent that. Nearly every year a trade union leader is murdered in the Philippines. That is the scandal. And for as long as the CEOs earn so much, it just shows that this is a modern manifestation of robbery, of thieving. Now, for about 25 years, I've been paying my old age pension contributions. I'm not a CEO, and when I retire, that's the only income that I will have, not like the CEO. So, Mr. Grete, is there any share that the old age pension system in which the old age pension system invests that comes from a company whose CEO's high salaries can be justified ethically? Answer. I don't believe that the CEOs are using their power to just further their own well-being. They are doing much more than that. Many CEOs and top managers are doing a lot to further the protection of the environment and for social justice. Maybe the picture isn't so stark, black and white, but I do agree entirely, and I believe firmly that a company like Credit Suisse, which has been criticized terribly, that was not doing very well and then recovered again, and a lot of work had to be done by the top management to re-establish this company again. These CEOs really deserve a salary that is higher than 1 million, at least during the time when they were working so hard to restructure. Afterwards, once the restructuring is over, such a salary is not justified anymore. And I've already said this in the past.
Sie haben nicht wirklich eine
You didn't really mention a company, did you? Oh, yes, you did mention the CS Credit Suisse. Yes, you did. Allez Gagner. If one thinks that about 50 million people die of hunger a year, then you cannot say that those few who do earn billions can have an influence or an effect or change things. Obviously, charity is not all. Perhaps one should try and explain to these managers that a man who came from the Bernese canton, Money Matter, said that if those who are extremely well off were to give a bit of what they have to those who have little, then those who have little would be a bit better off. If there was a little more distribution, everyone would be better off. Then these top CEOs wouldn't need bodyguards, they wouldn't have to be protected by barbed wire, they wouldn't have to be afraid all the time, and they would still have more than enough.
Vorne ist noch eine Frage. Hier, vielleicht können Sie die Hand noch mal hochhalten.
Someone here in the front who wants the microphone?
Walter Felix, bis vor kurzem
until not so long ago was a member of the Swiss Parliament. Mr. Grete knows this. Former bankers have done a lot to regulate ourselves against money laundering and so on and so forth. And that is what is so regrettable. We've done a lot in terms of self-regulation and good governance, but in concrete terms, in reality, this did not help very much. All the good practice proposed by Economist Suisse, nor what has been done at the stock market, which goes beyond what we have in the law on transparency, it hasn't really changed very much in the past few years. So my question, what kind of solution do we need? We have a very high caliber panel here. You listen to what is being said, and then we go home feeling that something ought to be done, but nothing may happen. But something must happen. There are all sorts of good proposals. If self-regulation doesn't have the result that we need, then, unfortunately, the legislator will have to step in. If the slogan continues to be valid that everything is allowed that is not forbidden, then maybe we need a few new bans and rules. It's very difficult to regulate or order or command well-being. Now, if I were still a member of parliament, then I would not be in favor of this new revision of the stock exchange law and the laws on shares. I still believe that it is the shareholders who should determine the salaries of the boards of directors, the members of these boards. How do you assess the value of a board member? Terms like performance, competition, labour market, responsibility were mentioned. I think for me the most important aspect is responsibility or accountability. Unfortunately, we are being shown examples. Just consider what the outcome of the Swissair lawsuit will be in terms of responsibility. I am sure, and though I'm not a legal expert, that most of those accused will go free. They will not be condemned. One has to have very specific criteria, objective criteria that are then at the basis of determining the remuneration of the boards of directors. And if we could achieve such criteria, then we would be making a lot of headway in the right direction. Well, may I ask you something? What do you think of the Minder initiative answer? Well, I think it's a good idea, but unfortunately all he is suggesting is that there should be an amendment of the Constitution, and I think that's the wrong solution because it's also too detailed. If you include the operating side, the operational side, then I would agree with you. I think you need certain directives for the board of directors. It is the shareholders who elect the board of directors. And in every contract you have provisions about the remuneration. The report of the OECD mentions this as well. And in many countries this is now the case. But I wouldn't go down to the operational level. Mr. Minder, do you want to respond? Well, fortunately we have direct democracy in Switzerland. It's only at the level of the Constitution that this can be settled, and I'm sorry to have to say this to a former member of the Parliament. The Swiss citizen is mature enough to be able to decide whether they want to accept the initiative or not. We don't have to tell the Swiss citizen what to do. If the Swiss citizens believe that it is too extreme, well, they'll reject it, they'll throw it out, and if it's accepted, then the legislation will be adapted. But please don't undermine our direct democracy. Are there any further questions? Of course, I'm very happy to hear what Member of Parliament, Mr. Walker, said. I'd like to add something to that. The managers and the board of directors are not just those who act, they are not the players, they're also victims, very much so, of the financial global markets. Therefore, it would also be very important to see that the large investments, the major investments such as the American pension funds, for example, also use criteria of sustainability when they evaluate the performance of their investments. And such standards have already been established. Some are still being developed. There's ISO standard 26000, for example, which is such a standard. These would be extremely useful because then the directors of the board would be able to refer back to these standards which would be imposed on them by the institutional investors or the major investors. Any further questions from the floor?
Okay.
I have a question for Mr. Grete. First of all, I would like to thank him for the wonderful work he's doing in the old age pension system. I'm speaking as a pensioner, as someone who gets his pension. I know that you try to attend all the shareholder meetings as possible and speak on behalf of those who have paid into the system. But the problem is that at such shareholder meetings you have 2,000, 3,000 people attending. These are the individual shareholders. And then you have a whole row where you have the large investors who are seated and who have all the power. And you simply cannot defend yourself as an individual investor. And then you have the hedge funds. And the hedge funds are a great threat. If the government, if the state does not reason the hedge funds and bring them into line, then I can see them as a really great threat and a problem for the pension funds in general. What do you say, Mr. Grete? Well, thank you very much for those thanks. That is very encouraging and reassuring. It's balm on some wounds. Now, in a PLC, in a public limited company, every shareholder holds voting rights commensurate with the amount invested. If you invest 100, then you get 100 voting rights. A shareholder who invests only 1 franc will only have 1 voting right, and I think that is fair. So how can you ensure equity or fairness? Now, if you had a larger number of shareholders, whether they are individuals or institutions, who actually use their voting right, then there won't be you won't have the dictatorship of the minority. Some people cannot physically attend the shareholders' meeting and therefore they are represented by proxy. And the purpose should not be to reduce this right of representation. One should, in fact, facilitate the proxy holding. Technically, this is possible. This is one of the points in the initiative of Mr. Minder. That's a very clever proposal. It should not, however, be enshrined in the Constitution. One should simply ensure that the voting right is actually exercised. This would certainly corral the abuse and the excesses to some extent. There will always be abuse and excess. Unfortunately, that is human nature.
Ich denke, wir können dies als Schlusswort.
Maybe we could take this as the conclusion. Unfortunately, the panelists have to rush off to other appointments. I would like to thank all of you for your attention and for the questions that have been put, which contributed to this discussion of the panel. Please just leave your headsets on your chairs. Don't take them home with you because the interpreters will not be heard once you use your headphones at home. And thank you, of course, also to the members of the panel, Mr. Ulrich from the University of St. Gall, Thomas Minder, the fighter, with his initiative. I'm quite sure we've understood that the only way things can be changed is by the
joining us. Danke, Herr Grete, und herzlichen Dank.
Thank you, Mr. Grete, and thank you to Mr. Johansson.